This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. Iran held early presidential elections following the death of President Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash. In the presidential runoff, which was held last week, reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian won with 53.7% of the votes. And unlike Raisi, who was a hardline conservative, Pezeshkian is a moderate. And during his campaign, he promised to work towards easing social restrictions, especially with regard to the hijab and also internet access. On the economic front, he has pledged to ease economic hardships by working to bring Iran out of the sanctions regime, which of course is only possible through sustained engagement with the West. But given that the final veto on any departure in policy or legislations rests with the clergy or with the supreme leader, what changes can Iranians realistically expect from the Pezeshkian presidency? Although a reformist, how will he get his appointments and legislations passed in a conservative dominated parliament? And what does the change in presidency mean for Iran's foreign policy? We discuss all these questions and more in this episode of In Focus. And we have with us Stanley Johnny, the Hindu's international affairs editor. Stanley, thank you so much and welcome back to In Focus.
Thanks for having me, Sampath.
So, Stanley, to start with, I was wondering if you can give us a quick overview of Pezeshkian's political background. I mean, and his campaign. What was the core plank on which he built his presidential run, where he was, of course, in competition with Saeed Jalili, who was a hardliner.
Sampath, he was relatively an obscure figure until the first round of the elections. But in Iran, he's been around for quite some time in Iran's politics. Because, if you look at his career, he's a heart surgeon, which is now, everybody is talking about it. But then his political entry happened in 1999 when he was appointed the deputy health minister by Mohammad Khatami. So Khatami is a really tall leader among Iran's reformists because he was the first reformist who became president. Proper reformist because he had a reformist agenda, and his presidency, his 8-year-long tenure, was basically tumultuous. Khatami faced strong resistance from the clergy. Khatami himself a cleric, but continued to support the reformist currents in Iranian society. So Pezeshkian was found and appointed deputy health minister by Khatami. And in Khatami's second term, which began in 2001, Pezeshkian was given a promotion. He was appointed the health minister. So basically, Khatami was his mentor. So that itself speaks volumes of his political beliefs. And then after Khatami's term, Ahmadinejad became the president. Ahmadinejad is a hardliner. He dropped Pezeshkian. But from 2008 onwards, he's been a member of Iran's Majlis, the Consultative Council or Iran's parliament. And he represents Tabriz. And he still holds that post. So from 2008 onwards, Pezeshkian has been a member of the Majlis. So he is a veteran for Iranians, though he is an obscure figure for those outside Iran. But he was a lightweight. He was not on the front lines of the reformist movement. Nobody heard of it. Nobody outside Iran had heard of it. But then what happened was that he had contested earlier. His presidential ambition is, it's out. It was public. He was contested earlier, but it was not successful. But this time his candidacy was approved by the Guardianship Council. So basically, if you look at his political orientation, so one thing is his association with Khatami. And then secondly, he had spoken out repeatedly against the way Iranian regime was handling protests. Because if you look at Iran's history, especially from 2009 onwards, Iran has seen repeated protests against the regime. And these protests were, different from the protests that happen in a democratic country where you would see protests against a particular legislation, against a policy of the government, etc., etc. In Iran, the protests always have this anti-regime character. And the protests were cracked down on by the regime itself.
So if the protests are anti-regime, what was the demand of these protesters, of these
So,
protests?
it differs. If you look at the slogans that were raised in the protests that held after Mirza Amini's death in 2022, they were giving slogans such as "Death to the Mullahs." So basically, they call for a change, radical changes in the system. And in 2009, the protests that were triggered by the re-election of President Ahmadinejad. Again, I mean, protesters were calling for a radical overhaul of the system. So at least a substantial chunk of the protesters see the system as oppressive and they want change from that. You know, so the Iranians call them, or the regime supporters call them, counter-revolutionaries. So this is the nature of the protests. So even in 2019, late 2019, there were massive protests across Iran against economic hardships. you know but the regime also mobilizes people. For example, in 2020 January, when Qasem Soleimani was assassinated by the United States, you also saw millions of people coming to the streets in defense of the regime. So it's an ongoing thing. It's not an easy black and white thing to say that the regime has lost complete legitimacy. That's not the case here. But the regime faces very strong opposition and resistance from its own people. That is a fact. So Pezeshkian had criticized the handling of the protesters. For example, in 2009, after Ahmadinejad's re-election, when the protests were cracked down, when the leaders of the Green Movement were house arrested, Pezeshkian had spoken out against the repressive measures used by security personnel. And more recently in 2022, after Mahsa Amini died while she was in custody, she was arrested by Iran's morality police for not wearing the hijab, the mandatory headscarf, properly. That was the charge against her. And she died while she was in custody, which triggered massive protests across Iran, which also brought in to highlight, the restrictions women face in the Islamic Republic. So Pezeshkian had spoken out against it. He did not support the protests. He called them engineered by protests were largely engineered by Iran's enemies. But at the same time, he called for the rights of what he called our sisters and daughters. He said, if I quote him, we oppose any violent and inhuman behavior towards anyone, notably our sisters and daughters, and will not allow these actions to happen under his watch. That's what he meant. This is what he said during the campaign. So, and also, as you mentioned, he promises, more internet freedom. He promises economic and political engagement with the West, etc., etc. So, largely, if you look at his policies, he falls into the category of a reformist. Because in Iran, there are no political parties, but there are political blocs. And these political blocs are largely divided into two categories. One is the principalist bloc, which is what we call hardliner, conservatives, ultra conservative. You see all kind of names in the Western press, but basically principalists. They are revolutionaries, hardcore revolutionaries. And then you have the reformers or moderates. The reformist camp itself is divided into reformists and moderates. For example, to put this in context, Muhammad Khatami was a reformist, but Hassan Rouhani was a moderate, right? So here, in the case of Pezeshkian, if you look at his policies, his association with Khatami, with the reformist coalition, he is basically a reformist president.
What exactly is the difference between a reformist and a moderate?
It's very difficult to identify the exact differences, but if you look at their policies, what generally is that moderates basically they are completely with the system, but they want to alleviate some measures, and they are kind of centrists. They are not calling for any major any radical changes in the system. Basically, they want to make the system function in a much more effective way, and they also appeal to larger sections of society, not only the hardliners, not only the working people, but the larger sections. But the reformists basically want to reform the system. They want to better the system by implementing reforms. For example, Khatami wanted to reform the electoral system to make it more participative. Khatami wanted to remove to address the mandatory hijab rules, to give more rights, the rights of choices to the women. But all his ideas were shot down by the establishment. So basically, this is the reformists wanted to bring in incremental or gradual changes in the system, whereas moderates are more or less centrists, and you have the principalists. This is how the political system is divided. So I think Pezeshkian clearly has mentioned during the campaign, during the television debates, that he wanted to reform the system. But then again, he's not a counter-revolutionary. That's a mistake some people make.
So, would it be correct to call Pezeshkian a reformist or a moderate, or is he both?
He is a reformist because he has. I mean, if you look at his campaign speeches, if you look at his earlier statements, if you look at his association with Muhammad Khatami, I think it is right to call him a reformist. But we have to see how he is going to function as president. But if you look at his statements, I think he is a reformist.
So, Stanley, you spoke about this different blocks, the principalists, the reformists, moderates, etc., in different sections of Iranian society. So, do these different blocks sort of are they present in the clergy as well? Are there sections of the clergy which are reformist?
Of course. Muhammad Khatami is a cleric. He is the leader of the reformist circles of Iran.
So reformist does not necessarily mean a more secular orientation, giving a secular orientation to the polity as such.
Not at all. Not at all. So I think we can't apply debates on secularism into the Iranian context. I think it's kind of out of place in Iran because you don't find
I mean, if
secularists.
you no, hold on, no, you're saying it's 1 second, Stanley. You said this secular kind of an approach is out of place, but when somebody, an Iranian woman, wants the right to choose whether to wear the hijab or not, on what grounds? I mean, I don't think she's going to invoke Islam to say that I should not be allowed to wear the hijab, right? She's going to bring up a secular notion such as a woman's freedom or something like that. So, from that point of view, wouldn't that be a kind of a more secular orientation of the reformists? Like, how do you argue against hardline religious imposition?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, what they are saying, if you look at the reformist camp of Iran's politics, what they are saying is that Islam allows women to choose their or women to choose their whatever their preferences. I mean, this is the debate. The debate is they are not taking it out of the context of Islam. So even both sides. Khatami is a cleric. Hassan Rouhani himself is a cleric. He's a white turban cleric who was the former president, who's a moderate. And Mohammad Ahmadinejad is a civilian. He's an engineer who's a hardline president, who was as hardline as Ebrahim Raisi. So these hardline and reformist blocks are not divided among clerics and non-clerics. You can see clerics on both camps. You can see non-cleric politicians, technocrats on both camps. That's one thing. And then, secondly, I think the debates about rights, women's rights, minority rights. So even the reformers place that in the larger Islamic context, not outside Islam. That's why I said, the traditional definition of secularism, you can't apply that in Iran's context because they all basically talk to the Islamic, how to change the Islamic structure. Even the reformists do the same thing. So in the case of Pezeshkian, he's a technocrat, he's a doctor, he was a health minister, he's not a cleric, he doesn't wear a turban, but he was supported by both Khatami and Hassan Rouhani. Both of them, the former presidents, one a reformist, the other a moderate, both of them had endorsed him. And the reformist camp, they faced back-to-back electoral setbacks in recent years, right? After Rouhani's term was over. In the presidential and parliamentary election, the hardliners won. And, until Raisi's death, if you look at different branches of Iran's system, all branches were controlled by the hardliners. Start from the Supreme Leader's office, and then the Majlis, Iranian parliament, the executive, which is the presidency. Raisi was the president. And then, the parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who was also a conservative, and then the judiciary. And of course, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Hardcore. So all the branches of the state were controlled by hardliners. But then, after the death of Raisi, when Pezeshkian's candidacy was approved by the Constitutional Council, which is also called the Guardianship Council, basically the reformists and the moderates found an opportunity.
So Stanley, just let me stop you there. I mean, Pezeshkian also tried to run for president in 2021, but the Guardian Council rejected his candidacy then. But this time they have approved it. Like how does that how does one understand this change of stance of the Guardian Council? How did they allow him in? It has Pezeshkian changed his politics, or is the politics of the Guardian Council changed? Like what is?
I don't think Pezeshkian has changed his politics, at least not to our knowledge. So he tried to stand in the race in 2013 and 2021. So in 2013, basically he registered for the election, but then he backed off and offered his support for Rafsanjani, who was a former hardline president who later made an alliance, de facto alliance with the moderates. But then eventually, Hassan Rouhani won 2013 election. So after Rouhani's two terms, then Pezeshkian registered for the election again in 2021. This time, the Guardianship Council rejected him, as you mentioned. But then, yeah, again in 2024, the big question is why he was allowed. Because in Iran's political system, the Constitutional Council can say who is to contest and who is not to contest. And once the names are cleared, the elections are largely free. I'm not calling it fair, but largely free. Except there were exceptions like in 2009. But besides that, the elections were largely free. Once the Guardianship Council.
The elections were largely free, as you said, Stanley, but everybody, at least in the Western media, is sort of pinpointing the fact that the turnout has been abysmal in less than 50%, 40% in the first round. I mean, isn't that a sort of a negative mark on the whole process?
Yeah, which is true. But then, if we discuss the turnout in the United States, that would also be, nobody is talking about it, right? It would be abysmally low in the United States historically. But yeah, of course, in Iran, we can. This is important. This is important for the Iranian rulers because they face some kind of a legitimacy crisis, according to some analysts. So yeah, and that is also the point I am coming to, the turnout point, because in 2009 the turnout was 80%, 79% plus percent, and from 79% in 2021 when Ebrahim Raisi was elected president, the turnout was 48%. So it basically fell below the halfway mark. So this is a huge drop, and the drop is one of the reasons is that the reform-minded Iranians, they stay out of the election as a means of protest against the system. This is the interpretation. So the regime wanted more and more people to come out and vote so that they can say that they are not facing any legitimacy crisis. And the system in Iran, unlike the monarchies across the Gulf, the system in Iran has some popular legitimacy, right? Unlike Saudi Arabia or the UAE, where you have a hereditary monarchy. Here, elections are there, parliamentary elections are there, presidential elections are there, though ultimate authority is in the hands of the supreme leader. So, but the regime still is trying to source some kind of legitimacy through the electoral process. So what happens here is that, after Ebrahim Raisi's death, basically there were repeated protests in the country, and people increasingly people were boycotting, especially the reform-oriented people were boycotting the elections. So it is, possible to assume that Iran's leaders sensed that, a crisis was brewing, and they have to they have to clear the candidacy of a reformist. And that's how Pezeshkian was actually approved. And in the first round, if you look at the results, Pezeshkian got some 42%, whereas Jalili got some 38%. And there was another conservative candidate who was the parliament speaker, Mohammad Bhagar, who got some 13%. So there was a possibility of a conservative consolidation behind Jalili in the second round. So if Pezeshkian wanted to win the election, what he had to do was to convince the reform-oriented Iranians to come out and vote for him. So if you look at their campaign in the 1 week between the first round and the second round, the Pezeshkian campaign was focused on bringing people out and vote. And that actually happened, because if the turnout was 39.9% in the first round on June the 28th, the turnout would jump to 49%, almost to 50% in the runoff elections. And I think that most of the people who came out to vote, those who didn't vote and those who came out in the runoff, were reform-oriented people. They voted for Pezeshkian. That's why, despite a conservative consolidation behind Jalili, Pezeshkian won 53.7% vote in the second round, and he became the president He became president-elect now. He would be inaugurated next month. So I think basically Pezeshkian could strike a chord with the reform-oriented people and bring them out and vote for him. Maybe this is what the regime also wanted. In a sense, the turnout has gone up again compared to what it was in the first round or in the last presidential election. So it's almost 50%. So at the end of the day, you can still say that 50% of Iran's electorate participated in the election process to elect the new president.
Right. Thank you for that, Stanley. I think that clarifies a lot of questions I had with regard to why did he get approval this time for contesting, and and how the whole process works. Now he is the president elect, as you said, but he's going to operate in a political power structure where the authority rests, the final authority rests with the supreme leader, who has a final say. He has a veto. So what function or role does the president really perform if everything is going to be decided ultimately by someone else?
Yeah, it's a strange system because the president is the highest elected official in Iran, but he is not the head of the state. Head of the state is the supreme leader. And his office is still the second highest, second most powerful office in the country. But if you look at Iran's constitution, all key officers report to the supreme leader. For example, the presidency reports to the supreme leader. The military reports to the supreme leader. IRGC reports to the supreme leader. The guardianship council, which which vets the candidate for the elections, reports to the supreme leader. And even the assembly of experts, which elects the supreme leader, which chooses the supreme leader once one supreme leader departs, is being filled by the people nominated by the supreme leader. So the supreme leader, if you look at Iran's constitution, all branches of the state report to the supreme leader, and the supreme leader is a very powerful position. But at the same time, as we discussed earlier, the popular legitimacy comes through parliament and president.
So who reports to the president then? If even the military and the IRGC report to the supreme leader, then who reports to the president?
His
Only the
cabinet.
cabinet.
Yeah, his cabinet. And practically, it's like, you look at the French system, no? But the difference is that in France, the president is being directly elected. Here, the supreme leader is not being directly elected. So in France, the government would run the day-to-day affairs of the country, including the economy, running the economy. Here, the president would do the same thing. But the supreme leader would be a more powerful person. The supreme leader would basically set the tone and tenor of the foreign policy, defense policy, security policy, whereas the economic policy, etc., would be run by the government. So the president will have a say in how to run the government. And the president is also here, the president is the sole source of the legitimacy because the supreme leader is kind of a religious figure. He is not directly elected by the people, but the president is. So the question is how Pezeshkian is going to resist, other branches of the system to champion his agenda. This is not going to be an easy task because Khatami tried and failed, right? Khatami was a charismatic leader who had the support of a larger number of Iranian public. But then he was also pushed back when he was the president. So here, again, the question, and also IRGC is kind of a guardians of the revolution. Whenever, even at that time, when Khatami refused to crack down on the protesters, IRGC had even issued an ultimatum to the president back in 1998. So here, Pezeshkian, he has to kind of, maneuver between the different branches of the system. But I think, okay, when it comes to larger foreign policy questions, his voice would be limited. But when it comes to issues such as women's rights, how to control the morality police, etc., I think the president will have a say, and the president's position would matter. Because if you look at recent Iran's history, the morality police became stronger and more powerful after Ebrahim Raisi became the president, not during Hassan Rouhani's time. So the president will have a say. So we have to see how Pezeshkian is going to basically maneuver between different branches and push for his agenda.
Right. Now, can we expect any shift in Iran's orientation towards the West? Because Pezeshkian has been very clear during his campaign. I mean, you just mentioned that the supreme leader will be dictating foreign policy. But having said that, Pezeshkian has been saying that his economic vision is basically getting Iran out of the sanctions regime. And you can't get Iran out of the sanctions regime unless you talk to the West. So talking to the West again is foreign policy, which again he will have to again get on the right side of the supreme leader's approach towards this subject. So how is this going to work?
So Pezeshkian has said what his position with regard to the nuclear deal is. He supports dialogue with the West. He wants to take Iran out of the sanctions. And this is, even if he is a very powerful president, even if he has the freedom to set the policy on the nuclear deal, I think it's not only in his hands, it's also in the hands of the United States. Because, it is the United States that destroyed the nuclear deal, not Iran. Iran was 100% compliant with the terms of the nuclear deal, but the Trump administration pulled the United States unilaterally out of the nuclear deal. And Iran did talk to the West, even under Ebrahim Raisi, not directly, but indirectly through Vienna. So they had multiple rounds of negotiations in Vienna. But the Biden administration and the Iranians did not come to any kind of consensus on how to revive the nuclear deal. One of the major stumbling blocks, I think, is the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization. So the Iranians say IRGC is part of Iran state, part of our military, and you call us a terrorist organization. How can we deal with you? And the Biden administration was not willing to remove the terrorist tag. And Iran also wanted lasting commitments from the United States, because if we once reached a deal with you and you pulled out of the deal, and if we reach a deal with you again, what guarantee you can give us that you won't do this again? So here the villain is not Iran, the villain is the United States when it comes to the destruction of the nuclear deal. So yes, Pezeshkian has said that he is willing to have dialogue with the West. The question is whether the West is willing to do the same. So I think we have to look at all these factors when it comes to reviving the nuclear deal. But if you ask for my opinion, I would say the chances are slim.
Okay, chances are slim despite a more reformist president in place. One last question, Stanley, before we wrap up. What about India? Like, would anything change for India with the new president coming in? We've traditionally had a pretty positive relationship, but which, of course, took a dip with the sanctions regime, and India had to pull out of many of these oil deals and so on, source oil from other places. So, what does the new president's coming into the scene mean for India-Iran relations?
I think the Iranians always preferred better ties with India, better, stronger economic ties with India. And we were kind of ambivalent, earlier when Manmohan Singh was the prime minister, and also in the early stages of the Modi government, because we were under pressure from the United States. But in recent years, you see India and Iran have shown a reinvigorated interest in strengthening their relationship, especially through the Chabahar port. So we recently signed an agreement. We have agreed to invest some $500 million in developing Chabahar and other projects, associated projects, etc., etc. So there is momentum in the relationship. And India also realizes that Iran geographically is a very important partner for India, because Chabahar offers a gateway to Central Asia, and also for the Chabahar and Bandar Abbas offer connection points for the north-south transport corridor with Russia that connects India through Iran, Azerbaijan, Russia to Northern Europe. So geographically speaking, Iran is a very important country. Even energy-wise it is, but energy you can buy from other countries, including Russia. But geography you can't swap. So there is, there is a fresh momentum in the relationship of late. So my assumption is that both the Pezeshkian government and the Indian government would stay the course or take the relationship to the next level.
Right. Thank you so much, Stanley. So just to sort of summarize what you've said, I mean, he is reformist. So he will try. We don't know with what amount of success to sort of ease restrictions on women, sort of ease the restrictions on internet freedom, and of course, with regard to foreign policy and the nuclear deal, he will have to sort of go with what the supreme leader has laid down the line. And when it comes to India, I think they will more or less stay the course. So it is going to be, if any changes do come in, it's going to be very incremental and not a big departure. I think that's what we can expect. But nonetheless, I think it is a good outcome for Iran. I mean, a person like him would, of course, confer, if there was any doubt, more legitimacy on the regime. And I think we're headed for interesting times in the region. Thank you so much, Stanley. Once again, pleasure talking to you.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.